Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving some time this afternoon to consider Gonski and where we are and where we need to head from here. I'd like to review where we've been and to look at where we're going with Gonski, because Gonski continues to be the one hope this nation has for a fair and equitable education system. We were set up in April 2010 and we were within the aftermath of the 2009 PISA results, which had shocked the nation. We suddenly realised that our international performance had declined sharply in both absolute and relative terms in comparison with other countries. Since the year 2000, we've developed a much stronger correlation between underperformance and aggregated social disadvantage than any other comparable country. The gap between our highest performing schools and our lowest performing schools was greater, far greater than the average for the 34 OECD countries. And that deterioration of achievement and standards was confirmed by other international, national and state surveys and research. Importantly, that research showed again and again that the relationship between aggregated social disadvantage and deteriorating performance is one of cause and effect. In response, Julia Gillard, she was then Education Minister, asked us to develop a funding system which is fair, transparent, financially sustainable and effective in promoting educational outcomes for all Australian students. We read, each of us individually, 7,000 submissions. We met with 71 key education groups, including AEU at state level, many of them several times. We contracted out several major research projects. We visited schools, only 39 in total, but hand-picked schools for particular reasons in all states. And we worked with a very skilled secretariat. And we reached unanimous agreement. There are no caveats or dissenting reports attached to Gonski. 6 people from an extraordinary range of different backgrounds, most of them from private school backgrounds, the majority of them Catholics, signed up to the most far-reaching education report since Carmel. And that report, frankly, has not been even partly implemented. The problem we set out to resolve remains. The 2012 PISA results have shown that the position has worsened. The 2015 results will inevitably show further deterioration. There is abundant other evidence that confirms that reality. Nothing that either the federal Labor government or the now federal coalition government have done since the tabling of the Gonski report will have arrested our national decline. Now, the Gonski panel concluded that stopping the decline rested on doing 2 things. Firstly, ensuring that every child, regardless of circumstances, receives the kind and amount of individual support needed to reach their maximum potential. And that is very different from every child receiving the same level of support. It is in the national interest that every child, regardless of socioeconomic background, race, ethnicity, language background, length of time in the country, school size and location, disability or any other circumstance, receives the kind and amount of support needed to experience education as a public good. The schools at the lower end of both the scale of aggregated social disadvantage and the scale of educational performance are, in my view, the emergency wards of Australian education. In a hospital emergency ward, there's a battery of medical specialists and intervention techniques and diagnostic tools and equipment targeted at the immediate recovery of the individual. A school with more than 60% of its intake being children with a language background other than English, from families from perhaps 10 different language groups, less than 3 years in the country and unlikely to stay more than 3 years in the school, is an emergency ward in the same real sense. And such schools are common in the Tasmanian school system as they are in the rest of Australia. A small rural school taking children from the long-term unemployed, some perhaps suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome, some of whom have never been read to or even held a book, is similarly an emergency ward. Children entering such schools require immediate diagnosis of need and immediate intensive care. They need smaller class sizes, the ready availability of teaching interventions delivered by fully qualified personnel, speech therapists, counsellors, school family liaison officers, including interpreters, and a range of other support. And we've failed in our allocation of education resources to address the needs of these children. We consign them in their thousands to the bin of underachievement, and as a nation we're squandering our national stock of human capital. The second thing we concluded was that we must ensure that educational achievement, the gaining of a senior secondary award, a TAFE certificate, a degree, a diploma, a graduate diploma, a higher degree, is available on the basis of talent and hard work alone, rather than preferentially available to those in a position of wealth and privilege. This second Gonski objective was one of equal opportunity. The strategic targeting of resources according to need will do much more than reduce the impact of disadvantage on educational outcomes. The flip side is that it will also reduce the impact of advantage and privilege on educational outcomes. If school performance is neither advantaged nor disadvantaged, by parental income, ethnic background, religion, school size or location, or whether a child attends an independent Catholic or public school, success at school will be determined essentially by the student's ability, application, and hard work. In other words, Gonski will create a genuine meritocracy. At present, the hard-working and talented children of the privileged have a somewhat better prospect of access to the very highest levels of educational achievement than children of the socially disadvantaged with similar potential. Gonski would change all that. All won't have prizes. This is about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. But those who do receive prizes will do so on the basis of hard work, ability, and application alone. Now, with those two objectives in mind, we set about what became a fundamental reimagining of Australian education. The Gonski report is fundamentally a rethinking of priorities and approaches and objectives in education, not an exercise in accountancy. It was never simply an argument for more funding. Its essence is how that funding is allocated and the purposes for which it is spent. Now, over the past 40 years, successive federal governments of both colours have allocated funding to three silos: the independent, Catholic and government school sectors. And you can include with Catholic the Seventh-day Adventist and the Lutherans, which are similarly small systems. They've allocated funding to those three silos after consultation with state governments, with independent school organisations such as the AIS, with church leaders and particularly the Catholic bishops, with teacher unions and with others. The decision has never been on the basis of the detailed assessment of individual schools. It's been essentially for 40 years a political settlement based on sectors and needs blind. Just what is needed to support the independent sector, the Catholic sector, and the state sector, or how the politics plays out and who ends up getting what. There's then been a series of post hoc equity programs designed to address some specific purposes, the most recent of which was the new partnerships funding. And those programs have been partially effective, some of them quite effective. They've been time limited. It is an absolute tragedy that while there has been real growth in education spending in the years 2000 to 2012, we've never spent more than now. The high watermark years of sector-based needs-blind funding, our national performance has declined. Too much has been spent on schools that don't need it. Not enough has been spent on what matters and where it matters. Now, the Gonski model turns that all on its head. It is sector-blind and needs-based. Initially, sector-based and needs-blind. Gonski, sector-blind and needs-based. The model is based on assessment of the particular resource requirements of each individual school in the country, a task which New South Wales has already demonstrated is perfectly feasible because it's completed the job. The model proposes that all schools, regardless of the silo to which they belong, should be resourced to the levels of those schools in which at least 80% of students are achieving above a minimum national standard in literacy and numeracy. And that's highly aspirational. At the time we wrote the report, only 16% of the schools in the country were at that level. We were proposing to raise all of them to that level in terms of resourcing. We called that the school resourcing standard. The figure now is in fact less than 16%. They're hitting that target. The model proposes a base level of funding for all schools and loadings for the different elements of aggregated social disadvantage. Instead of separate equity programs, it brings equity funding into the mainstream. And what is eventually spent in each sector is to be the sum of the needs of the schools in that sector, built up from the bottom, not the result of a political settlement pushed out from the top. And that is very, very radical. We also propose that there should be additional funding, along with loadings for the aggregated disadvantage factors, for extensive, substantial or supplementary adjustments required to support learning of children with disability. We recommended that the disability loading should be provided to a school in the form of a disability entitlement based on the number of children requiring different levels of assistance, whether it's a public, Catholic or private school, and regardless of its socio-economic status. And we did that for three reasons. To give parents of a child with a disability the same choice between school sectors as other parents, to relieve the pressure on public schools, which were bearing the heaviest burden by far of children with a disability, and to ensure that non-government schools could meet their legal requirement to provide access to students with disability across the full range. And recognising the high resourcing demands of all special schools, we recommended that non-government special schools should receive a loaded per student amount that is fully publicly funded, as would occur in government special schools. And we believe that those measures would ensure the provision of education as a public good for all young Australians with disability in a way that has never happened before. We made some major recommendations too on the more effective use and coordination of capital works funding by Commonwealth and state governments. We recommended establishing a new school growth fund to support the establishment of new schools and existing schools, and to establish school planning authorities in each state with government and non-government school representation to manage the planning and development of new and existing schools. And we made an absolutely crucial recommendation, which we regarded as critical to implementation of all those reforms. And that was that the Commonwealth Government should establish, through the Ministerial Council with state and territory ministers, a Commonwealth State National Schools Resourcing Body, or NSRB. And this was to be appointed by and responsible to, as I say, the Council of Ministers rather than the Commonwealth Government. We saw it as being akin to the Schools Commission in many ways, within the framework of the Gonski model and using the most recent and detailed state and territory data. Its task was to reach agreement on the per capita level of funding, the specific loadings for the various categories of disadvantage, and the minimum private and minimum public contributions. On that basis, it was then to recommend to the Ministerial Council on the school resourcing standard for the country as a whole and its indexation factor. It was to oversee the implementation of the recommendations on students with disability and capital works, and that, of course, was to be done within the framework of available funding from the Commonwealth and state governments. They were our recommendations. If Gonski is to be implemented, they were the recommendations to be implemented. Now, the then federal government cherry-picked a small part of the report and ignored the rest of it. It ignored completely the disability and capital works recommendations. It acknowledged the importance of targeting resources to need, but ignored our recommendations on the way this should be done. It kept, and still keeps, the new government, the funding silos. It retained top-down sector-based funding. It rejected our recommendation on building up the resources allocated to each sector on the basis of the measurement and of the needs of the individual schools. It rejected building this funding from the bottom up. And it ignored our recommendation on establishing a joint Commonwealth State National Schools Resourcing Body, which we saw as critical. And instead, it chose to negotiate with each of the individual states and territories bilaterally. It undercut the national consensus that we built up over 19 months of the Gonski process on the basis of protracted and patient negotiation with independent Catholic and government school authorities at local, state and national levels, with student, parent and community organisations, with principals associations and teacher unions, and with business and industry, university, special interest groups and the community generally. And the bilateral negotiations were not a public and open process, as would have been the discussions of the National Schools Resourcing Body. They dragged on for 21 months, longer than it took us to write the report, until the September 2013 election, and it ended in an unholy scramble to secure an agreement to deals in which the fundamental Gonski principles became a secondary consideration. The schooling resource standard set out in the Australian Education Act is far below the aspiration level of the Gonski report. The result that we have now across the country and in every state is thoroughly unsatisfactory. Agreements with some states and not with others, and amongst participating states, different agreements and different indexation arrangements. Now, like the other states, participating states, Tasmania finds itself in a difficult position. It needs the full 6 years of funding if it's to come anywhere near establishing a common school resourcing standard, even well below the Gonski aspiration. Children in those Tasmanian schools I've referred to as the emergency wards of Australian education will continue not to get a fair go. And conservatively, just looking at the figures in the Broad, that's about 20% or more of your public schools. The difference between funding levels for government and non-government schools will be further increased, not reduced. And as in the other states, despite the misnomer Gonski agreements, I think a term which goes back to the days of Minister Garrett, the heads of agreement that Tasmania signed with the Commonwealth is not really an agreement to implement Gonski. It's not an agreement that the funding be allocated on a needs basis, regardless of the sector to which schools belong. It does not specify the level at which the resource standard is to be set. It doesn't specify that there will be base funding and loadings for low socioeconomic status, school size and location, indigeneity and limited English language proficiency, which is what Gonski says. It does not specify that funding is to be spent on what matters in the classroom, such things as instructional leadership, diagnostic assessment, differentiated teaching and learning, tiered intervention, and family and community engagement. The common reference then for the first 4 years or the last 2 years of the Gonski funding is quite misleading. It seems to me, reading the thing as an independent person, not politically aligned, that Better Schools Tasmania is not about implementing Gonski, but about reforms in the specified areas of quality teaching, quality learning, meeting teacher need, empowered school leadership, and transparency and accountability. That's what the agreement says. Now, these are mostly very important, but we do need to be thoughtful about them. For example, everyone welcomes the continued upskilling of teachers, but Australia's problem, Tasmania's problem, is not the quality of its teachers, but the quality of its education. Our poor international performance and our steep social gradient cannot be explained away by poor teacher quality. The teachers in your most disadvantaged and low-performing public and Catholic schools are just as skilled as those in your more advantaged schools. The issue is not their competence, their skill, or their commitment. The issue is that their task is more challenging, their numbers are inadequate, and the necessary paraprofessional support is lacking. For example, every child in the country should be given the support necessary to learn to read to minimum national standard by year 8, so that they can effectively read to learn from then on. If they miss that watershed, if they're still decoding in years 4, 5 and 6, their learning rapidly falls behind. it is crucial we get every kid effectively reading by age 8. And if to achieve that, a refugee child newly arrived in Tasmania, not speaking English and from a very poor family, requires greater support than the child of a third generation Australian family in secure employment with an income twice the national average, then so be it. We have for years accepted such needs-based differentials in the provision of many other kinds of public good, most notably perhaps the differential per capita cost of roads in urban and rural Australia. Improvement in the quality of education costs money. It's not an alternative to Gonski. Gonski is the central prerequisite. Unless you do Gonski, you're not going to get that. Another example, your agreement refers to empowered school leadership, school autonomy and parent participation. New government's putting money into that, Gonski money into that, so-called Gonski money into that. Now, every government school in England, that is maintained schools, which include faith-based schools in England, has the autonomy of independent public schools in Western Australia, governing boards that can hire and fire staff, head teachers and staff, determine salaries and promotions, and so on. Yet, and I was there 9 years, we're heading their curriculum and assessment body, it's very clear that school performance in England varies enormously from school to school and from region to region, essentially related to aggregated social disadvantage. All these schools across the country have autonomy, but the ones in the depressed north of the country are performing far worse than those in the leafy home counties surrounding London. It's a function of advantage and affluence. So we need to be careful, I think, about school autonomy and empowered leadership. Empowerment and autonomy sound appealing, but it's the quality of the whole school instructional leadership of the principal that's important for students' learning, not whether the principal has the capacity to borrow money from the bank to build capital works or to hire and fire staff. And building high quality instructional leadership in schools costs money. It's not an alternative to Gonski. You can't do it without Gonski. Similarly, parental engagement is critical to school improvement. By building effective engagement, for example, with Aboriginal communities and newly arrived communities from different language and cultural backgrounds, you need very substantial resourcing. Improved parental engagement's not a substitute for Gonski. It requires Gonski if it's to be effective. Consider this example. In Tasmania, and as in Australia as a whole, the gap in reading performance between the top 20% of Year 9 students, who are mainly in affluent schools, and the bottom 20%, who are mainly in disadvantaged schools, is currently equivalent to 5 years of schooling. It's an appalling situation, unequalled in the OECD. 1 in 5 of your 15-year-olds, and those on the mainland, is reading it no better than the result. It's reading it no better than mid-primary level. Now, that is not the result of poor teaching. It is not the result of an inadequate cultural left curriculum. It's not the result of failing to make reading Thomas Hardy compulsory in Year 8. It's not the result of insufficient autonomy for government schools and their principals. It's not the result of lack of IT bandwidth and servers. It's not the result of a lack of transparency and accountability. It is the direct result of sector-based needs-blind funding. And that will not change until that situation is reversed. There is no alternative. Now, the Tasmanian government is criticised by the AEU for spending only 3.8 million of the 20 million for 2014-15 on the school resource package and its fairer funding model for government schools. And I sympathise with the AEU position. I would prefer to see all of the funding directed to the school resource package, as in New South Wales, where the Liberal National Party government is implementing a Gonski-based resource allocation model. All of its funding is going through the school gate. But it seems to me that the other 6 budget lines to which the funding has been allocated in Tasmania, curriculum development, workforce development, and so on, are legitimate expenditure under this document, the Heads of Agreement. They're not directly about Gonski, because the agreement, unhappily, is not about Gonski. But I don't think what is happening is contrary to the terms of that very inadequate agreement. So what is to be done? I've got 5 thoughts about what I think is in Tasmania's interests. I think the fundamental objective must be to go back to the drawing board. The solution is for the Commonwealth Government to do what its predecessor failed to do, which is implement the Gonski reforms properly and with shared ownership by the states and territories, by setting up the National Schools Resourcing Body to operate within the framework of the total pool of available funding. We are in a hell of a mess. It can't be resolved in any other way than saying let's cut our losses and go back to what was the original proposition, and this time do it well. There's no solution to our deteriorating national performance other than a system of sector-neutral, needs-based funding to support the strategic delivery of classroom and school reforms about which there is really very little disagreement. Very little disagreement. Second, we should heed the advice of Justice Michael Kirby in his speech to the Centre for Public Education last year, that the priority is unfortunately again to make the case for the Gonski reform to the Australian electorate. And this the previous federal government failed to do adequately, and the current federal government does not want to do at all. The objective should be to elect a pro-Gonski federal government at the next election, either coalition or Labor or some other coalition. And I'm immensely encouraged by state governments that are prepared to commit to the Gonski principles and to bear the cost of implementation. And that support, together with support from state opposition parties and some federal backbenchers, does bring real pressure on the federal government leadership. There also seems to me, from substantial discussions I've had around the country, much support to build, much potential to build support among the more disadvantaged non-government schools and their parents, and with those many elements of the Catholic sector in which there is a strong social justice perspective. I've talked to groups of Catholic principals of parish schools who are very strong on this. I'm also encouraged by the strong interest amongst business and industry groups, which understand the imperative of maximising our national stock of human capital, and that we can't allow 8-year-olds, for example, simply to go to waste. The future of the country depends on building on their capacities. Nothing the federal government has done or said it will do or can do other than implement needs-based funding will prevent further decline in our national performance in the next round of PISA results in 2015, which will become available in the first part of 2016. And barring a double dissolution or an early election later this year, the first date at which the next election for the House and half Senate can be held is 6th of August 2016. So Gonski will be right back on the agenda. We will have the same situation we had in 2009, only worse. And third, we must all have the arguments at hand to counter the fallacious and frequently dishonest assertions made in the media. And I know the AEU has been very good on providing briefings on this, and the papers of the Senate Education Committee last year are also very good on this. Despite claims that there's no evidence that increased expenditure will improve school performance, the positive impact of increased funding on student and school performance is overwhelmingly reported in the literature. The jury is in on that. The relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement is also beyond question. And that's true however socioeconomic status is defined, either narrowly as parental occupation or income, or more broadly as the Index of Economic, Social and Cultural Status, which is the measure PISA uses, and which includes parental occupation, parental educational attainment, and home possessions relating to wealth, educational resources, and cultural possessions, or even more broadly as aggregated social disadvantage, which is the Gonski measure, to which we added to the PISA measure indigeneity, language proficiency, and geographic location. Again, the jury is in on this. There is no question. Christopher Pyne, the great fixer, would have Australians believe that the problem is simply that students in government schools are being taught an unchallenging curriculum by poor teachers. That's the problem to the Minister. Fix the curriculum and fix the teachers, and we'll be back there at the top with Finland and Singapore. It's as simple as that. The point is that we each individually cannot afford to let such nonsense go unchallenged at any level, from the press and radio down to a dinner table conversation or a chat with a parent, if things are to be turned around at the next election. Fourth, keep the pressure on the Labor Party, because they have a lot to answer for. The reason we don't have Gonski today is not because the country elected a Liberal National Party government, but because the Labor government failed in its implementation. And in Victoria, the new Labor government has reintroduced automatic funding for Catholic and independent schools as a proportion of government school funding, the very antithesis of Gonski and its lengthy argument as to why that is nonsense. Nearly 2 years after the 2013 election, the federal opposition has no roadmap apart from a promise to fund the full 6 years. Why does the opposition not commit to setting up a national schools resourcing body, as we recommended, which would surely be immensely attractive to the states and territories as the basis for implementing needs-based funding once it returns to government? And fifth, whoever forms the next government, a rejuvenated Labor government, or a more enlightened group of Liberals and Nationals or Greens, we must drop the undertaking that no school should lose $1, which has been an albatross around the neck of the Gonski panel and the Gonski process. I'm not suggesting the end of state aid to non-government schools, but taking up David Gonski's comment in his Blackburn oration, I do not believe that it is in the interest of the nation and the individual that whatever funding is available should be spent strategically on the schools that need it, government and non-government, and on the things that matter. That's where it should be spent, rather than on schools that don't need it and on the things that are simply nice to have. Vast sums of money have been wasted. And if it's a choice between using recurrent funding by a quite legitimate accounting treatment to fund the overdraft or whatever on a new boat shed, or to teach 8-year-olds in a disadvantaged school to read and write, that's where the funding should go. In conclusion, Gonski lives. Gonski is still on the table. Gonski is there for implementation. And ensuring that Gonski lives, great credit must be given to the AEU for its highly successful national campaign to keep this issue at the forefront of the government, of the public mind. Without that campaign, without the I Give a Gonski campaign, the neoconservative right would have swept away the Gonski agenda. It not only remains, but it has much cross-party support. I firmly believe that sector-blind, needs-based funding along the lines of the Gonski model will eventually be introduced to this country. The longer the delay, the greater the deterioration in our national standards, the greater the injustice to individuals, and the greater the loss of our potential national stock of human capital. It is not widely known, I think, yet, but at the end of the month, Penguin Books is publishing a book, I Gave a Gonski, which is the speeches of David Gonski. And it's being launched in Sydney. And you know who is launching it? Malcolm Turnbull. So let us trust that at some stage there'll be federal and state governments that will be prepared and able